on. Yeah. And I don't think there's any new people on the call today. So Brian, would you mind saying a few words of where we kind of left off and where we're kind of, how the next step on some of those conversations?
Sure. Let me share my screen here. This was the document that the shared document that we were working on. I'll pop the URL for it into the chat momentarily. We had some general thoughts on demos. One was the proposal that we deploy on the interop.community meld. And we had a number of folks speak in favor of that. Nobody object to it. So I turned that over to Daniel to run with putting together a liaison relationship with interop.community between the NIC and Project Unify. And so that's what we're looking forward to doing in terms of actually deploying demos from here on out. That we need to think about what consent service utility we leverage. Right now, interop.community is standing up the LEAP CDS consent service utility. And I also asserted, and this was really just a dangling some bait for Jim St. Clair, that we need open source person matching and person identity, maybe FIDO or Linux. There's also bait for Dave Walsh. So I don't expect either of you to bite on it right now, but it's something we should start a new conversation about with the new year. So the user stories and demos, this is just, and I want to highlight, this was brainstorming. This is not that we're going to do all these demos because we couldn't even possibly write all the user stories associated with these. This was just to get an idea from the wisdom of the masses here, both in the meeting last week and some folks that contributed to the document after the meeting. What are some various ideas in terms of what domains might a demo or user story be associated with, what the user story might be, and who the member stakeholders might be that could more immediately leverage any proof of concept that we came up with. And so obviously we got a number of them in the education, across education and health, across education and homelessness, health and homelessness. I threw in one on early childhood education, both because I'd gotten interest from both New Jersey Inc. and Child Care Aware of America for something along those lines, but also because SEDS just stood up this week a new early childhood education or early learning working group. So I knew that there's going to be some activity going on. I counted, I think, 55 people on that meeting on Monday. So there are some folks out there that we may be able to lure into our sandbox here to address some of those kinds of concerns. Child welfare and human services, child welfare in general, human services legal, justice, human services and homelessness, and child welfare and justice. Now, one of the things that came up since then was a proposal from the National Science Foundation. They've been doing some work on an open knowledge network, and we had some folks that were interested in from the NEAM program office in having us work on some kind of a cross-domain user story and demo involving NEAM and some non-NEAM domains. And Eric and I spent some time on Friday talking through since one of the domains that we know is based on NEAM is the justice domain. He and I spent some time talking about this particular use case of how do we deal with excarceration? What happens when somebody is released from prison or from jail, and very often ends up finding themselves back in a community without a house, without a home, without a job without means of feeding themselves, getting health care, et cetera. So what do we need to, as a society, what do we need to do in order to streamline the bringing somebody out of prison and back into a community and provide them the either the homeless shelters that they need in the interim and long term, the human services they need in order to go back to being a contributing member of society. And you can throw whatever high-minded words you want around that, but it seemed like a possible use case for this NEAM National Science Foundation opportunity. And that's what I got. Does anybody have anything they want to throw in there? Daniel or Jim or Paul or, yes, Daniel, you had your finger up.
Well, I was just going to say the next step about the OASIS and NEAM as a program office, just the timing of that happening. I think that people may not know that. Do you want to say just a word or two about that?
Sure. NEAM has long had a challenge with adoption, especially at an industry level, because it wasn't viewed as being a real standard. It was a government requirement, and therefore kind of a government standard. If you wanted to build something that met a specific need for a specific agency that had already adopted NEAM and had defined some message specifications, NEAM IEPDs, but it has always had a little bit of difficulty getting traction amongst the developers, at least those outside of the Beltway bandits around Washington, D.C. So this past year we did and I was on the NEAM Technical Architecture Committee for a good deal of this. We did an analysis of what existing standards organizations could NEAM be standardized through, or should NEAM decide to become a standards body in its own right and jump through the necessary hoops to be recognized through ANSI and ISO, et cetera. And ultimately, we determined that the best opportunity and fastest opportunity for NEAM to be adopted as a standard would be to be merged in with OASIS. And so that is what is happening over the course of this calendar year. Slowly but surely, the NEAM program office is evolving to be a executive committee for a NEAM standards working group within OASIS, or NEAM standards focus within OASIS. And the NEAM TAC is going to become a resource for all of the working groups underneath this NEAM focus group, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So on the one hand, it's exciting because it means that NEAM will be on the road to formal standardization and acceptance as a de jure standard rather than just a de facto standard associated with the US government. It also is somewhat exciting because it provides a whole new governance body around working on NEAM projects and ensuring appropriate voting mechanisms are in place, and embracing of community members rather than it all being driven by US government agency heads. On the other hand, it's also a little scary because the NEAM program office and the US government is ceding some control here to a big industry organization, consortium. So we shall see how it plays out. Is that what you wanted, Daniel?
Absolutely, yeah. Actually, just as a little add-on to that, I actually witnessed when NEAM got pulled back into government, as opposed to being an industry partnership, because I was at ACF at the time, and there was a very explicit action to say we can't give up that control to all those other people, and so it ostracized industry because there was no place for them to work. And that was right on human services. That was when ACF had gotten the first shot at being the program overlords for human services, and almost got it started. We had a meeting at actually a Medicaid conference once to get it started. We actually had an open source community, but it shortly thereafter died.
We have no
So
other comments on this. I'm going to stop sharing.
Hey,
again.
Daniel,
yeah, Tom, were you saying something?
Daniel, quick question. Um, for Brian.
Tom, I can't hear you. Can
Yeah, can
anyone
you
hear?
hear me?
No, it's all fuzzy.
Breaking up and garbling.
You're in the matrix.
All right, well, while we wait for
Take the blue
Tom,
pill.
while we wait for Tom to come back in. Jim, did any of those, I know that we had talked about adding your voice to some of those areas as we continue to explore working more closely with, with the Linux Foundation and the work we're doing at Unify and the consent work. So I don't know if you have any reflections on that before we move on.
Yeah, the patient identity. So I talked about a couple of those things with Mary Kratz as well, and patient identity definitely. There isn't much in the way of open source patient matching, and patient matching is a real thorny topic. I've been working that for months on the HL7 patient identity work group. And the reason we're working it for months is find me a healthcare organization that's willing to lay their cards on the table and say, yeah, that's a good enough match. We'll go with that. Whether it's exchanging healthcare data or cutting off a leg. And the relationship, obviously, between an identity and a discernible identity and the parameters for a match, and whether or not you accept probabilistic matching, whether you need some form of direct one-to-one. I've thrown out the fact that, in Lean Six Sigma, a 99.99967% level of accuracy at Six Sigma level of accuracy still means there's a couple hundred people that die every year because we didn't match them up properly. Are we willing to accept that? And if not, what's the alternative? So that little soliloquy was just to highlight that patient matching is a challenge we'll have to work through, but certainly on board the patient identity, as well as any other components that we want to have from an open source perspective.
Jim, is there any resources that you could point to of essentially benchmarking existing algorithms for patient matching, like that, like a true comparison where you're actually like you have proof on the statistics of the effectiveness of this versus that? Isn't
that I'm sorry, Matthew, please finish.
So that there's an apples to apples comparison. So whether it's open source or it's not, at least from a statistically proven perspective that this algorithm performed this way, this algorithm performed that way. The black box approach, where you're just kind of trusting that it's effective is very concerning, right?
That's a wonderful question. And wouldn't you think that there would be a federal agency that would take it upon themselves to provide an independent review of how Cerner matches patients and how Epic matches patients and how we do? And the answer is no. So your question is very valid. Has there ever been a level of national patient safety quality metric evaluation of patient matching algorithms that are incorporated into, the two largest EHR systems in the US? And there's not, though, in the defense of those EHR system users or the EHRs themselves, how much you can fault the algorithm when there is challenges associated with even what are the primary characteristics I need in order to ensure a match. And going back over 10 years ago, there was a patient identity integrity work group in HIMSS that I was part of for a while. And we did a white paper, and I could dig it up. I want to say it's something like 2009, something absurd, around, hey, if you want to have at least an 85% probabilistic match, which 85% is probably pretty low or unacceptably low for most people, you need to have at least 5 characteristics. And then the challenge is, depending on the demographics of the population that you're serving, can they easily provide 5 characteristics? And what do I do if one, excuse me, if one individual has typed in Maria Rose Johnson and someone else has typed in Maria Johnson and someone else has typed in Rose Johnson, and what, you know, and based on other characteristics, what do I find acceptable for matching those? But you know, long answer short being that no, that hasn't been done for benchmarking, and there isn't a established, agreed upon benchmarking principle at a federal policy level.
Tim, you might we might want to talk to Civitas Networks for Health, the new chic organization, because I mean, this is at the core of what we HIEs do all day, every day. And we've had a lot of discussions about it among our technical folks and our HIM folks. I mean, my HIE has an HIM committee that reviews and approves all of our algorithms and what can match automatically, what has to have a person intervene, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm happy to hook you up with our CIO, who is a patient identity, not only guru, but is an incredible believer in the fact that this is so core to our business that it has to be our primary, you know, responsibility to get it right.
Kathy, I'd love to talk to you about it, because we've had at least a couple listening sessions with the ONC Fast HL7 working group that had representatives in from a number of the payers and a select number of HIEs and Sequoia and a few others. And your affirmation is one of the strongest I've heard. And in particular, a lingering concern about, you know, if it's a patient-directed information request across the HIE, ensuring that you meet HIPAA compliance for matching that patient for the information they're requesting when they say, just tell me everything you have on me. So I'd be thrilled to connect and discuss that further.
I'd like to raise the bar a little bit on this, because I think it's great to have conversations about patient matching and recognizing the challenge there. But I would love to see the kind of technology and approaches that you're talking about for patient matching also extend to student matching, to child matching in child welfare systems, to clients in the juvenile justice system, because our biggest challenge here is not just patient matching within healthcare systems. It's how do we match a patient in a healthcare system to a student in a student information system, or a child in a child welfare system, and ensure that we're all still talking about the same individual in these records across different systems.
I think, Brian, that's really where what we do in the HIE is relevant, because for us, it's person matching, not patient matching.
Right.
And, you know, for example, during COVID, we've worked with the New York City Board of Ed, where we've literally sent them a list of every school-age child in our master person index. And they have then sent us back a culled list of all the people on whom they want data, because they can't just give us a list out of their system. They have to do this convoluted thing. But, you know, we've done it with the Department of Homeless Services and other things. So it can, you know, we look at the attributes of the person, not just the medical record number or whatever's used only within the healthcare system. And there are a couple of companies out there that use a lot of the publicly available data, like Verado, that's bringing in things from the clearinghouses and, you know, the
what gets complicated is when you're looking at those attributes, and depending on the system, the weightings have to be changed. And so making sure that whomever is kind of tweaking the algorithms really understands the data that's coming in. And address, you know, is everybody thinks that doesn't have any any real bias to it, but it does, depending on the system that it comes from. If it's coming from probation, I mean, what is your incentive to update address versus if it's coming from SNAP versus if it's coming from healthcare? And so being able to apply those weightings appropriately, that's one area where when talking to some of the partners, like Verado and others who do that, that's where it starts getting a little complicated, is having kind of the familiarity to manage across the systems.
So there might be an opportunity for MELD, because I think MELD has that patient generation of like real, like something that looks like patient data, right? So we could generate, maybe we could generate 10,000 or 20,000, however many records, and see if we can invite vendors to participate to try their algorithms on it. I think there may be a lack of enthusiasm, in part because vendors may not want to be kind of measured up against each other and potentially embarrassed that some other organization is better at this. But maybe there's a role to bring some transparency to the process if we can get participants in Project Unify on this. I don't know, it's just an idea. What do other people think?
I think it's really hard to do at this scale.
Mhm.
As has already been articulated, a lot has to do with the implementation. So driving standardization, the way the Bronx, Rio implemented identity management is probably entirely different than the way San Diego did it. So it's hard to control implementations at a state or county level, right? All we can do is hope to influence and provide a framework and guidance.
Isn't it timing as well?
It speaks to, it's not necessarily time, it's who participates and who's the 800-pound gorilla in terms of the geography you're talking about. So there's so much variety and dispersion in implementation that this is really going to be tough to solve, open source or otherwise. And that includes accountability, Matt. I appreciate what you're saying, but a lot has to do with how the technology is implemented in a locale or within a hospital.
Yeah,
I mean,
I'm not.
all Cerner and Epic implementations don't do identity the same way.
Right.
I'm not familiar with how the MELD product works and this product that generates patient data, but because it's fake data, there may be, what I was suggesting is, there may be a way to make an apples to apples comparison, even if the algorithm itself is closed source, right? Because in theory, we would know something about the data that we've generated, and then you test the different algorithms and see how they perform. I don't know if that's practical in terms of like whether you can get companies to come to the table, or we'd have to go into more details if that was something that wanted to be explored. But that was in a controlled environment.
So,
Well, quick thought here. Just the customers of these vendors can test for themselves what the match efficacy or effectiveness, I guess, is. So you don't necessarily need the company's buy-in. You could have a customer of, say, an HMIS, crank a list of, since they're starting to all offer APIs, post a list of clients and see how well they match with a pre-existing set of clients in that customer's account, and the vendor doesn't even need to.
keep going here. Keep going.
My wallet's in here. You want me to
Oh.
leave it?
Yeah, what's the other key?
And so I'm thinking what Matt's going after is entirely possible without vendor cooperation. Just the customers own their own data. They're using the algorithms offered. It's a black box anyway, so they're just checking the performance that they see and reporting on it. And then obviously, what Dan was talking about with the guidance and best practices, and then saying, well, the customer could approach the vendor or the consortium, we could as well, and say, look, one of your customers said their match rate was X using this protocol for testing. we can help you. These are some best practices. Are you doing these things? If not, please do them. And if they disagree, they can tell us how we can improve our algorithm, thereby improving the knowledge base. So maybe there is a path here with black boxes and without company consent, because the clients do own their own data.
And they own the algorithms as to how the identity and the matching occurs.
Well, algorithms tend to be proprietary for some of them.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Jim, would there be I guess the question we started with is, are there open alternatives that are helpful here?
It would be great to have some.
You know, we were talking about that at the end of the last session, which was,
Daniel, can you hear me yet?
not so good. Tom, you might want to call in. You just dial the number and you can stay on and just call in as well. And then you can jump in.
Yeah, okay. I guess that's bad network, I think. Okay.
Just call back in. It'll be fine. I think that's where we actually, one of the ahas from last conversation we had, this is probably a good segue, which is, you know, identity within healthcare, identity within child welfare, identity within education, or identity within justice. You know, these are the universes. And so who's going to be the system of systems, right? Who's going to, in a sense, architect, not changing all of them, but just synchronizing, kind of like the web, you know, like the web telescope, you know, synchronizing all those pieces so that they can actually do that. And I think that's got to be an open, communal, coordinated, and that's what we're working towards, right? And that's why we're in conversations with Linux to put this stuff, to create that, create a home for it, make it happen. And you all know we're pursuing as much as we, you know, as aggressively as we can to stand up these POCs in New York and New Jersey and California and Colorado maybe, and you know, the various places that are standing up. And so we're doing it. 2022 is the year of doing it. You know, maybe it'll be a small bite, maybe it'll be as long as it's in the right direction is helpful. But I have to say that, you know, the use case that we're taking around, I guess, use case around consent and actually demonstrating something, every conversation I have is a way to make things, to reduce friction, put it that way. A significant way that affects everybody to reduce friction, if you can get your arms around that. So that kind of open source system of systems harmonizer, especially around consent in the sectors and across the sectors, is a really giant thing we're trying to accomplish. And it's awesomely big. I mean, it's gigantic. So, but we have the opportunity to get implemented, right, in places in 2022 with the right partners at the table. If we can just navigate the labyrinth that, you know, government sets up and industry sets up to actually go do something good. But we're on the way. We've got momentum. There's a lot of people coming together around this and supporting it, which is wonderful. And I just had a conversation today with a small county in Michigan that connected. They've already, and actually they run the Ford, maybe people know them in Michigan, the Ford, it's connected to Henry Ford and the whole town there. I forgot the name of the town. 200,000 people. They've implemented everything. They've got the technology in place, and they are looking for consent as well. It's just everybody I talk to just sort of harmonizes with this. Anyway, I'm excited. You know, we're moving into 2022, and a lot of work to do. But before we move into conversation with Michael, because I think it's totally appropriate, Jennifer has a hand up, and if there are any other comments, then we'll forward that. Jennifer. Okay.
Hi, sorry if you can't hear me. I'm
No, you're good.
doing weird
You're good.
stuff. So I just wanted to mention, and this could be a whole other conversation. I just wanted to pick the brains of this group a little bit. I'm about to kick off a pilot where we have a super narrow scope. It's not gonna encompass all of the scenarios, but basically in the scenario of a nuclear client wanting to use
We're
some
kind of, Jennifer, let me stop you for a second.
these
Jennifer, let me
across
stop you.
programs.
Jennifer. Let me stop you for a second because we're getting every like third word. So it's tantalizing, but I think I'm seeing confusion on people's faces. Another good reason to have your phone on, your camera on. Could you try again? Maybe you're
Okay.
move a little bit. Maybe it's a part of your.
Today might not be the day. Maybe I'll try towards the end of the meeting.
Now it sounds good. Now it actually was working. Go,
Okay.
Try it again. I'll stop you if it doesn't.
Okay. So basically I'm about to kick off a pilot, and the idea that I've been pitching is that it's kind of a hybrid of a couple of these different technologies. So it's a super narrow scope. So it's in the, and I know that there's a bazillion scenarios, but in the scenario creating a new client, I want to use search capabilities across programs via APIs. So an API searches across programs and then makes a call to like a Verado service. No technology has been identified, but I'm just using it for context. And look for a match across those to supplement a business rule that would, like the first tier of our business rules, like that, confirming that's a match. And then using that to identify additional further programmatic business rules of a match. And at least build in that business process up front that alleviates duplication, but also obviously helps to serve clients as far as program and other services availability.
Cool.
So I think it's kind of a hybrid of what everybody's been kind of talking about. So I'd love to hear feedback. If anybody has interest in having additional conversation, please reach out to me. I'm going to get off because I have too much background noise going on.
Nah. You know what? We can actually schedule some of that time next week or two, if that's helpful as well. We can put it on the agenda. But thanks for sharing.
Sounds good.
Thanks for sharing that, Jennifer. So with that, let me pivot over to Michael. Thank you for listening in on our conversation here. The context, that's great. So I said a lot already about Mike. It's the intersections are great, and I'm really looking forward to it. The preparation we had for this conversation was how does that work also around healthcare, which I always want to bring this back to. How does that intersect with social care? So I asked them also to think about that. We've had some conversations in that area. So with that, Michael, let me turn it over to you. And again, you can ask for questions whenever, and we'll encourage people to add them as they got them.
All right, thank you, Daniel.
Yep.
I'm going to, no, sorry. Try to start it at the beginning. So I appreciate the conversation because just by way of background, I do modeling. And so a lot of what you're discussing is very essential for the kinds of things we're trying to do. And my training is in a completely different area because I'm trained as a theoretical chemist. But I'm going to give you sort of a top level overview of some things that we've been doing in terms of systems approaches, using a healthcare example. And then I've added a small piece on our social determinants of health work. And so really where I start is that if we look in any literature right now, commercial, scientific, whatever, we have lots of words on and terms on technologies and data. And one of the issues is they're all trying to be directed at taking the experimental data and converting it into problem solving in medicine. But one of the questions we come up with is, are you producing clinical solutions, or are you producing word salad, if people are familiar with that word, which actually comes out of psychiatry? And being sort of a fan of minimalism, I revert back, instead of in this world, to trying to ask what are the basic questions. And these questions are things that I carried over from when I was in high school and took journalism, that really what you need to identify and answer are the who, what, where, when, and why questions. So who is for a system, especially who's everyone that's involved, whether active, passive, client, observer, patient. And in the case of healthcare, we'll emphasize patient, provider, pharma, and payer. And then what are the expectations of each of these players? Where do they function, generate and use data, create value, and have sensitivities that need to be considered? And then recognize that we frequently talk about disease as a disease state, but diseases are really processes that evolve over time, and we need to always bring back time into our consideration. And then why? What are the real challenges and issues that exist? And when we consider the approach of asking questions, I always go back to this quote from Deming, that if you do not know how to ask the right question, you discover nothing. Or the corollary that I have is that we only ask questions about simple things, we'll only get answers about simple things as well. And so we're interested in understanding complexity. And I guess we define the levels of complexity in disease as the complexity of the patient, the complexity of the disease, and the complexity of the way medicine's practiced. And so it's the fact that those three things are not really necessarily well synchronized or understood. And so I'm going to use the example of MS. It's one of the main disease areas we work in. We work in about 4 main areas right now, but this is just a good prototype. And I highlighted some of the facts that we've considered, or a lot of people consider very critical, that in the US alone, it's about a $28 billion a year set of costs. There are about 1 million patients in terms of prevalence in the US, 2.5 million globally. There's a very high clinical trial failure rate, especially in phase 3. And even for the drugs that are approved by the FDA, clinical acceptance can be very difficult. The average time to diagnosis, which is most directly affecting the patients, it takes about 5 years typically, and that there is a 1 in 5 probability of a misdiagnosis or misdiagnosis. And so it's important to recognize then that these are real issues. And what we're interested in is there a root cause for these discrete observations? And if there is that something that's unique to MS, or can we learn about what it means in other diseases and use it to study other diseases? So the fact that I pointed out a couple of those issues in MS, we can see that they really are challenges in healthcare at a very large scale. Inappropriate medical testing right now costs about $200 billion a year, involving about 30,000 deaths. Misdiagnosis is roughly 10 to 15% of all diagnoses, which comes out to between 1 and 200 million, and about 80,000 of those result in serious harm. And then medication, this is just with Medicare Part D, about 43 billion doses of inappropriate medication cost about $25 billion. But the challenges are costly in terms of their impact on people, not just dollars. And obviously that's a very important focus of what we want to do. So if we, just by way of brief introduction to MS, for those of you who may not be familiar with it, there's 4 diagnostic categories. 3 are the primary ones, that you have relapsing remitting MS, which is about 85% of all diagnoses right now. You have primary progressive, which is about 10%. And then you have progressive relapsing, which is about 5%. But in that 85%, you also have the fact that about half of those patients will transition to what they call secondary progressive MS. So you can imagine then that companies that have a commercial interest like pharma are going to focus on patients with a relapsing remitting MS condition, if possible, because it's going to be a much larger target population, unless they come up with drugs that show specificity and can be driven into some of these other areas. But as I pointed out, misdiagnosis is about 1 in 5 cases. And you've got this the different types of MS that I pointed out before. And so there's a complexity in how these overlay on top of these diagnostic categories we're using. And if we look at the numbers, the incidence of MS each year is about 12,000 patients in the US who are newly diagnosed. And based on some cost studies, that estimated cost for that 12,000 patients alone is about almost $2.5 billion. And relapsing MS is close to $2 billion a year in drug costs. So you can see why pharma has been and continues to be interested in this, but also payers are obviously going to be interested even beyond what the provider and patient focus is. So if we only look at that relapsing remitting, we know from the data that about half of those patients who are going to progress will progress in 10 years. 40% of them will take about 25 years to progress, and then about 10% of them don't progress. And so even with that simple stratification, we know that there are likely at least 3 different subtypes of relapsing remitting. And if we were able to better stratify patients at the time of initial diagnosis, we may manage them differently and have better outcomes for them. But it also means that if you're in pharma and you're recruiting into a clinical trial and you're using relapsing remitting as one of the main inclusion exclusion criteria, you also are going to be subject to a potential heterogeneity in the patients you enroll, which is going to impact the ability of the drug to be tested adequately or to reflect the real world population, which impacts how a drug that is approved may actually treat patients in the clinic when they come through the door. So again, being a minimalist and a modeler, I had to start looking at what I consider the patient journey. And I started with the idea that if any patient, all patients, have some sort of risk associated with them for a variety of reasons that I'll show you in a minute, but they progress to show a series of symptoms. And then interacting with the clinical system, clinical signs are measured through clinical evaluation, testing, and so on, to come up with a diagnosis that results in treatment options, selected treatment, and then outcomes, which could be disease-free survival, overall survival, delayed progression, or also things that impact quality of life. And then realistically, what happens at this point is the patient comes back to the beginning again because they're going to encounter another condition or another disease. And so this is a constant cycle, not just a linear process. But as we look at this, what we also know is that looking at this patient journey is the system of what we call healthcare. And we have all of these different players in this system looking at this journey, but they all look at it from a different perspective, which obviously is associated with their priorities. Now, I liken this to, I use the analogy that it's like having a house where everyone's looking in a different window, seeing something different, and not necessarily recognizing what other people are seeing, nor sometimes that it's a house. And what we're interested in is really understanding this. That analogy actually is not, although it's contemporary, really is very much a derivative of the blind men and the elephant story that's been told many times about the blind men encountering an elephant, not understanding it is an elephant. But that actually points out that there's an elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is we don't have good data and we don't have a good understanding of this progression. And some of the points in the discussion before actually relate to this because we don't always have the data integrated in a way that allows us to really look at that entire trajectory as we need to, especially if we're looking at population. And so one of the things we decided to do was to, instead of trying to satisfy the goals and needs of the individual groups, to focus on building a model of the house or the elephant, so to speak, and build a model of the trajectory. and then allow each of these groups to have their own view into that, but in a way that as they look into this trajectory, they also have the opportunity to look beyond what their normal view is because they're looking at it as an integrated system. And the way we did that is basically we built an ontology. And the ontology was designed, I've worked in about 20 different diseases because I've worked in pharma and academia and a variety of different places. And what I decided to do was build an ontology that's disease agnostic. And so this is a high level, but what you see is there's nothing in here that relates to a specific disease. And in any given disease, some of these factors are more important than in other diseases or more well-developed. But the goal is to have a uniform or comprehensive ontology that allows us to represent this journey. And the purpose of using the ontology is, of course, having been built on concepts and relationships, it gives us a model that's functional, but also can be adapted as we learn new things to expand that ontology and not break the model, so to speak. It also serves as a data model because what we're able to do is now take data from any source and link it into a functional model that reflects the patient journey through this. And we find that can be important because one of the things we're looking at is the fact that diagnostics at different points in time may actually reflect different observations or be related to different processes and give different values. And that, again, is where some of the time element comes in. Dan, do you want me to pull the chat up?
Yeah, I'm just looking at, I just noticed it, I wasn't seeing it.
And the answer to this is yes, and I'll show you some of what we're doing about that.
Great.
So again, we're building this as a learning system, and now actually we've been taking this and converting it into a knowledge graph, and that's been done for a variety of reasons. It gives us access to more tools and visualization capabilities. And so one of the things we're doing, of course, then is taking this kind of model and mapping it into the MS. So effectively, this is MS mapped into that minimalist model where we're taking the patient who has early symptoms, we're looking at their differential diagnosis, assignment into the classical diagnostic categories, effectively then attempting to do staging and drug assignments to have your outcome. When we've done a deep dive into this, and I'll show you a little bit of that, I won't be able to show you all of that. One of the things we find is that there are a number of points that we think should be challenged in this process. And those points I highlight here. And they come about by now going into what, as I said, is a deep dive. So if we take a look at this box alone, one of the things we do is we try to expand that to reflect how clinical practice is being manifest, looking at the protocols, guidelines, looking at the testing availability and so on. And so if we just take this one box and expand it, we see that we're looking at this process or series of processes. And fundamentally, we're looking at a patient, and I'm only highlighting a couple of these here, but a patient who may have been managed for some conditions prior to coming in for their MS focused clinical assessment, but some of those may have not been incorporated into any clinical presentation, but are observations, things that we call the prodrome of the condition. We know that in general, we don't have good biomarkers, even though we use MR as one of them for white lesions. I'll get to that in a minute. But what we have to do is fundamentally rule out other conditions that may have similar presentation. This all leads to some of the delay in the actual diagnosis. And as you can imagine, you have a patient who still needs to be managed for symptoms along the path before a diagnosis actually is produced that would be MS, so that they may be more directly managed for that particular condition. And so among the things we're doing is we're looking at how to optimize the transition through these to minimize the testing protocols and the elimination. And that is based on actual the integration of the clinical data. As I pointed out, this is where the discussion earlier about linking data from a variety of different sources becomes extremely important, especially as we go across specialties and across systems that need to be integrated. One of the problems we're faced with then, as we go a bit more deeply, is how are these conditions actually designated and differentiated? And this is pretty much the pattern that is used to come up with the different subcategories or diagnostic categories of what this looks like. And one of the issues is that there's a great deal of subjectivity involved in coming up with this, even though we're using something called an EDSS score. The EDSS score is really monitoring a combination of perturbations in different pathophysiologic systems, where each one may have its own subjectivity in terms of its evaluation, but collectively, they're individually scored and then summed to give us our EDSS score. As you can see from the drawing, even the EDSS score does have a tendency to focus quite a bit on walking abilities. So there is a bias in that. But you can easily imagine that a score may result from points associated with these systems or points associated with these systems that give you the same score, but actually should differentiate the patient. So one of the things we've actually done is now started to look at this in its full dimensionality to understand how better to group and classify patients, not just use these composite scores. And in medicine, a lot of composite scores, that's how I address this or term this, are used for a matter of convenience, but they do have the potential to minimize the ability to see the real heterogeneity in the population, but they are guideposts that are frequently used in the standard of care. One of the things we're doing then is we're trying to shift into what we call a data-driven paradigm. So we're moving from the idea that we have a diagnosis and we're looking for all of the data or presentations in the clinic that lead to a patient ending up with this diagnosis. And rather what we're doing is we're looking at trajectories of clinical presentation over time, finding patients using that data who progress similarly, and then assigning a diagnosis based on that similarity of those trajectories. So that's where we're trying to drive the trajectory and the diagnosis out of the data rather than assigning the diagnosis and seeing what fits into that diagnostic category. As I'll mention a bit later on, we're using something called a community detection algorithm that we developed with some colleagues that is now being implemented in a quantum computer environment so that we can actually scale this up quite significantly in terms of the amount and complexity of the data that are being used. And we've applied this in heart failure and a number of other conditions as well. I also mentioned the prodrome issue. There are significant efforts trying to establish how early a patient may have been identified as being on this trajectory into MS. And among the things that are used are the number of, or an increase in physician visits or hospital admissions. There are other observations that are also being used, which are onset symptom clusters. Now, in a project that we did with HIMSS as a member of the innovation committee, one of the things we started to look at was this whole issue of prodrome. What happens is onset symptoms have been analyzed, collected out of the EHRs and patient interviews, and then the probability and eventually overall risk for each of these conditions being associated with an MS diagnosis has been ascertained. But what's more important to understand is not whether a given condition has been observed, but when did these occur, in what order did these occur, and which symptoms may have occurred together in clusters. And that's the kind of analysis that we are able to do now with our community detection algorithms. So we're trying to move beyond a lot of what's been done, either with looking at these kinds of onset symptoms or using ICD-10 codes or ICD-9 codes, which we know are claims data and not necessarily fully comprehensive data about the diagnostic, the clinical aspects of the patient, and trying to see how we can actually do this data-driven type of analysis. I mentioned also briefly that one of the key markers, because other markers are not really have been consistent, is the presence of white lesions, which is actually where the term sclerosis came from. And so the presence of white lesions in the MR has been followed for a very long time, probably longer than most of the other markers that have been measured. But one of the issues that we raise is, are we chasing some of the low-hanging fruit? Because these are things we can visualize and then try to correlate. And here we're correlating them with some of the diagnostic categories that I mentioned are not necessarily adequate to define the actual patients and need further, and in which we're working on further stratification. But are we trying to align something that has a relationship that's not clear and in itself may be very heterogeneous? So one of the things we're doing is we're saying that given the fact that patient presentation in the clinic allows us to start to look where different functional regions of the cerebral cortex may be involved, can we use the same kind of image processing technology that we're using to study the white lesions and go back into these MRs and look for small perturbations in these regions that may or may not be directly associated with white lesions that might give us other markers that we could use that the MR contains, but because of the presence of the white lesions, we actually haven't noticed or followed very accurately in these studies. So what we're trying to do is come up with different ways that we can take data that we already have and think about the problem in somewhat more innovative ways, taking it apart in terms of the questions and not just accepting some of the things that are in the current standard of care. And I mentioned, of course, obviously before, the idea of the data-driven approach. And let me turn briefly to, at the end now, to things we're doing with the social determinants, because that's actually how I first met Daniel in the HIMSS SDOH committee. This gives you from the CDC the main categories of the social determinants of health that are being used. And we can expand that list quite a bit. The tendency is that a lot of these, when they're studied, are studied almost individually. And what we have been interested in is the fact that they are not independent and they may change over time as well. And so what we're looking at is we've used this to basically create a knowledge graph and again, apply the community detection algorithms to be able to identify which parameters may be operating together or in clusters that need to be looked at more at a higher level than just the individual risk factors that frequently are the subject of a lot of studies, especially a lot of the epidemiologic studies. In addition, though, we think it's important to understand that this whole influence on an individual, while social determinants of health are critical and very important coming from a variety of different sources, we also need to understand what we call cultural determinants and trust determinants, because to a certain level, what we're doing is we're pushing down social determinants in terms of what we believe to be the values that should be agreed upon. But because we work in a number of immigrant populations, we know that the social determinants are not uniformly acceptable, both for cultural and trust regions. And that is going to drive what the individual's motivation and response is, regardless of the efforts that's being pushed into these social determinants from the top. And so what we've done is we've done a similar expansion into our knowledge graph of looking at cultural and trust determinants as well. And the last thing that I'll point out, so that we have time for discussion and questions, is community detection allows us to apply graphical analysis methods to the data we're looking at. This is from a heart failure study, but it shows you that what we're looking at is a fully connected graph where we can identify, using these algorithms, what groupings of parameters are actually much more closely associated to understand where we should be looking for not just single events or single factors, but combinations. These are, this study was actually done with collaborators at the National Research Council in Italy and the Quantum Computing Inc. group that we work with. The last part of this then is, how do we get to these parameters? And how do we build our knowledge graphs? And I won't go into this except at a very high level. Typically, what we would do to build a knowledge graph is we would potentially do something like take natural language processing over a variety of different sources, pull out the concepts and relationships and build our knowledge graph, and then try to apply that to our problem areas. What we found, though, especially when we're looking at what is in the data, is that a lot of these sources, because it's the nature of almost all published studies, have some type of bias in them, just as any clinical trial has some type of bias in it. As a result, the knowledge graph that you would build in this manner has a bias built into it that becomes very difficult to extract. So what we've done is we've changed this process. We actually start in a very generic manner to build the conceptual knowledge graph, which we then evaluate using natural language processing against the literature to identify whether the relationships between parameters that we see in the knowledge graph actually are supported with data, whether there's conflicts or whether there's gaps in that data or in knowledge, in data to support those relationships. And we're using that then to actually drive additional questions and additional studies to do that kind of completion. There's one more question. We usually do this. I'm sorry. I'd have to show you some slides.
Let's open it, Mike, let's open it to conversation.
Yeah, I was exactly. I was just going to end with this slide, which is
love it.
That these problems are not new, and we think it's as important to know what you don't know as it is to know what you do know. And I was just going to leave that as if people would like to connect on or get more in-depth information about any of these things. But yes, I'm sorry. The next step is to open it up for discussion.
Fantastic. You know, actually, if you could go back a couple of slides with the inverted arrow. Yeah, no, go forward. One more. Yeah, that's the idea that I wanted to bring to the group, which was these problems are so big and large and complex that we need to really think about it differently. And as interestingly, knowledge graphs and a lot of other things are really starting to percolate to the surface here. And the complexity that you describe, you know, the culture and the trust parameters, along with SDOH, I think is also really important. I know people think about it, but how do you actually model that? How do you turn that into knowledge and actionable knowledge? So thank you for sharing that. It's It's an amazing body of work, but I'm interested in what folks have to say, or think, Matt, you have a question here, or a question about hearing more?
Yeah, I have several questions, but I don't want to over
One at a
dominate.
time, one at a time,
So
one at a time.
can you say more about starting with how you start with a conceptual knowledge graph and what that's based on, if it's not based on the research or the data, and how you then go back to the research?
Yeah, so what we've done is we've defined 6 domains that define a patient. I didn't include the slides, but the domains are their genomic makeup, their environmental makeup, their lifestyle, their family history, their clinical history, and then one that includes social determinants, cultural determinants, and trust determinants. And what we've done is we've gone through and built that up as a very generic level to create the knowledge graph that's fully connected among those 6 domains. Now, that doesn't mean that there's data underneath to support those connections. And that's where we use the natural language processing to evaluate whether data has been identified that supports the connections, or that's a gap in our understanding.
So is there some kind of simulation model, some kind of algorithm that defines the interplay between those domains? Is that?
Well, it's fully connected. They're fully connected. So just as I showed you.
Right.
This is a fully connected graph.
Right.
Okay. So it's taken all the parameters, all the clinical variables, all the patient data, all the patients. This again is from our heart failure study, and created all of those links. And what we're analyzing in this case is which are the predominant groupings that would be used to stratify that into groups. I don't like to use the word clustering because it's not a conventional clustering kind of approach. But in the same vein, we're doing that with the 6 domains that I just described, where we've now populated them with all the concepts. The initial definition of the relationships is that they're all interconnected. So we're starting off with all of them connected, okay, or potentially connected, and then evaluating where data exists to support those connections.
So is your going assumption that they're weighted equally, these connections, before you bring in the data? How would you weight
before we bring in the data? Before we bring in the data, yes.
So you say, okay, all these 6 domains, they're all equal, and then let's see what happens when the data comes in. Is that right?
Right.
Okay, now I understand.
And as Eric said, the knowledge graph is just an extension of what we've done with the ontologies.
Matt, you got your hand up still, or?
Yep. So Michael, I'd like to know where you're going with this in terms of practical application. That's kind of question 1, but I'll start with maybe the easier one. Are you getting any traction on the trust and cultural domains of health? Have you served that up to Gravity? It's an interesting model and probably incredibly relevant. And I think you can make a case, you only spent a couple of seconds on that slide, that trust and cultural determinants of health may be even more influential than the social determinants of health, though the social determinants of health are easier to measure.
Well, we have been doing a study with the Philadelphia Corporation of Aging where we're looking at the 12 immigrant populations. And what happened was they came to us because they were providing long-term social services that weren't being accepted. And they didn't know how to deal with that. And what we said was, it's because you're not you don't understand what the cultural factors and the trust factors are. And that's how we started to build the model so that we could separate that. And now what we've done is we're working in Cameroon, as an example. Cameroon has 280 tribes. It has 4 major groups. And we've selected, looking at building it with the Cameroonian population, with those tribes because we're working with the government, and then looking at what happens when they actually immigrate to the US, where the cultural changes don't occur, but the social determinants changes occur. And so we're trying to use that as a calibration measure, just to give you an idea of how we're applying it in real cases.
You know that Matt has a question in the chat here, which is just following on that last question
Yeah.
around building trust. Obviously there are, I'm interested in this given all the potential overlaps and trying to better integrate, the other non-medical factors, right? How do you do that, as you clearly outlined here? And in the work we just completed around a scan on informed consent and our intentions to build a consent utility fundamentally come down to trust, especially for those populations who are least likely to trust government and have the greatest need to be connected at the local level. A number of months ago, we had a director from Arlington County, Virginia, on talking about how they built actually a 2-page consent, universal consent that they've effectively utilized across the county. And one of the reasons for success was because they have a lot of community health workers that they've built up over the years, having long-term existing relationships. So people come into this county system, into the offered services through a trusted, warm hand. And so they had almost complete compliance with sharing their data on a 2-page, Dan, you saw it, I don't know if you saw it, a 2-page form, which took 5 years to negotiate with their attorneys. So that idea of trust and culture is something to that question of building that within an organization, within on the ground with people and people of lived experience.
Trust impacts identity, trust impacts consent, trust impacts equity and collecting race and nationality. It's a huge component in what we're trying to do and very difficult to measure on any agreed scale.
I agreed. We are doing this with the immigrant population in Philadelphia. We're doing it with focus group in that studies. So we have focus groups in the different immigrant populations. But of course, even in the immigrant populations, you have to start stratifying them because they're not single entities.
Right. Well, one of the challenges with the immigrant population, as I'm sure as you know, Michael, is birth date, right? As to what is the birth date in records, because many times it's the date that they've been admitted to the United States versus their actual birth date, and that just takes you down a trust spiral that's hard to get out of.
Yeah, I'm involved in the NIH COVID program where I'm focused on pregnancy, and trying to establish gestational age is almost impossible. So.
Cool. Other thoughts? I'm so interested in helping, and we had this conversation already twice today, around developing systems thinking. And that's a different way of solving a complex problem, as you started with, right? You started saying, you ask simple questions, you get simple answers, maybe. These are complex, challenging questions and situations that we're all trying to work on here. And so being able to bring some technology, being able to bring knowledge graphs to use by people who have to deal with a whole set of factors and make decisions based on insufficient and bad information. Is there hope? I guess the question is, are we gonna, how far can the knowledge take us to changing policy and practice? And how far do you have to implement against it, I guess? How do you increase the implementation in many ways? Because we got to stop admiring the problems in some ways.
But what we see, I mean, it's an iterative approach, because what we're seeing is as we add more complexity, The drive is, are we getting value out of it? Or are we just adding
Yeah.
complexity?
Right.
And, you know, in healthcare, we're making much better decisions about clinical trials, about understanding how to treat patients. And so we use it to actually drive those kinds of decisions. And eventually it gets back into designing a clinical trial from the beginning, not just fixing a clinical trial after it doesn't work, or fixing a drug after it doesn't work, to understand why.
Right, and the social context has such, it's so much richer in some ways in narrative data, and I think probably poorer even in structured data, because it's the inconsistencies. One of the things that Eric and Brian and a bunch of folks, Matt, on this call have been dealing with is sort of the integration of the different ontologies. And looking at the interface between, you know, within justice and education and human services and healthcare, and what are those common ontologies that ultimately, you know, that systems approach, how can you translate, you know, is it a Rosetta Stone that you can actually design to work in an open source environment, which would come back to the start of the conversation today. Being able to have that kind of computational graph ability, I think is essential.
Yeah, I guess our philosophy is the complexity is there. We can either choose to ignore it, or we can try to start to bring it in. We're not going to be perfect. We're never going to close the gap, but especially if we can start to show that it enhances our ability to do the things and solve the problems we need, then we should continue to try, because things aren't going to become less complex if we ignore them. They're only going to become more complex, because there's going to be more data streams that you're going to have to integrate. And you're integrating them because the technology is available, not necessarily, you know, we're looking at diabetes monitoring. There's a question as to the value in many cases as to having continuous glucose monitoring. In some individuals, it's very critical. In others, it's not. The same with cardiac measurements.
I had a question I was just going to ask you. Oh, in terms of actually implementation, can you assume, I guess you can't because of knowledge graphs, that NLP will not be a critical component of actually making this all work? AI has got to be in this to make sense of all the complexity.
Yeah, we're using the NLP, but we're not using it to drive the knowledge graph creation. We're using it to process the existing literature, so to speak, to evaluate the relationships in the knowledge graph. So the question is there a relationship between two of the concepts that we would link? If we have a fully connected graph, and we take two concepts, is there data to support that in the literature or not? And how good is that data? And that's where we use the NLP to try to get to those answers. So we don't generate the link because of the data, because we don't know what those biases are, but we're looking all the time to see if there's conflicting data or if there's missing data about certain relationships.
Have you come up with a way to kind of weight the trustedness of a study? Or, I mean, like in selecting, you know, your literature, that will have its own kind of process. You found a way of weighting that. And then also, if you can say anything about your philosophy about AI, there's a lot of black box kind of deep learning AI in healthcare, and there's a trend towards more explainable AI and knowledge graphs being among them.
Yeah. So part of the answer to your first question is we go very deeply. Again, I'm trained in theoretical chemistry. We go very deeply. So an example would be one of our areas is triple negative breast cancer. I don't know if you're familiar with that at all, but it's three different receptors or two receptors
Hmm.
and a growth factor. And technically, you're supposed to be negative in all three to get that diagnosis.
Hmm.
But if you go into the granularity of the data, different labs test those differently, and they're not compatible. And different institutions assign different threshold levels that aren't compatible. And so a patient who's triple negative in one institution may not be triple negative in another one.
That's horrible.
Okay. But that drives everything from payer decisions to pharma decisions to managing a patient. And so that's where we go into that granularity to understand what the confidence is in using that actual data. And obviously we run into, more often than not, a brick wall because that detail isn't available. It's not managed in an EHR, but we know to ask those questions and keep throwing those questions back into the system to try to get refined. In terms of the black box side of AI, we did many years ago, actually back in the mid 90s, a study on heart transplants and matching donors and recipients. We found some very weak signals. If we only went with the black box model, they would have disappeared. But those weak signals actually had a major impact on how to match donor and recipient. We didn't have a population to support statistical analysis, but it pointed out a relationship that then over the years, as they accumulated more data, they could show was statistically significant and made a big difference in how to match donor and recipient. And so I personally have that's why that very first slide that I showed with the word salad, so to speak. We don't use conventional AI and deep learning because we are very focused on causality, and we want to understand as much as we can, knowing that we're not perfect, but we are looking at this level of granularity that's necessary to really understand it.
Great work. Outstanding presentation. Yeah.
I'll second that.
I just wanted to add something. This is because related to our work with the LEAP project we're doing this year. And what we are actually doing is building knowledge graphs from EHR data to analyze as input to AI applications. So the approach is in and of itself is very interesting to me. And as for the comment about weighing the trustfulness or confidence on the data, that is something that keeps coming up in our work as well. And that is something we're working on actively. And the way currently we are approaching this is to simply assign data weight or classifications, like things like, is this patient reported, is this measured by a lab, or things like that. But this is interesting work, so I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, and the example I give when I teach about the quality of data in EHR is a very simple one. Every EHR has your blood pressure in it. There's 20 different ways to measure blood pressure. None of those are recorded, and your blood pressure can vary 20 points based on how it's measured.
More.
Or more.
Yes. Yeah, so that's one of our challenges.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of our the challenges we are trying to solve with this LEAP approach.
Yeah, well, and that's why we take that kind of data and discount the ability of it to have full confidence in it.
Well, that's one of the things we keep trying to do here at the National Collaborative, is to bring people together to share some stuff from outer space or from inner space for that matter. And you know, there's always some connection between the worlds that are happening. So I hope that we'll be able to sort of continue this conversation. There's things coming up with the work on consent, the work on Ken Salyard's coordinating at the federal level on children and families, work that's happening in the integrated care for kids sites, and a variety of other places with the NSF. Some new interesting requests for connected, coordinated kinds of things. I think that there's a reason for the collaboration to keep going and to find, and to continue to focus in at least on our consent work, and ideally with more resources to be able to expand our scope and our scale a little bit, as Brian had laid out in the beginning of the call, so that we could kind of keep on track with what's going on. Next week we have the folks from, so I just spaced their name. Brian, what's the name of the group that was going to be speaking? Can you help me with that? FIDO, right. So identity management stuff. And then the following week, we'll be talking, I think, about NEAM and what's happening in a little greater detail around OASIS and potentially the role between different systems. Other topics are always welcome, and Amanda will send out notes from this meeting, and we'll post the recording on the site if others want to view it. And with that, I want to say thanks. Thanks for taking time, Michael, for preparing and for presenting. And people are interested, your email is available to folks, and we invite you back to continue to be part of the conversation as your schedule permits.
No, thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
It's great. Yes, Amanda said February topics. We got some slots open in February, so hopefully we'll be preparing for either some HIMSS kinds of conversations or other things that may present themselves as we go along here. With that, I want to say thanks everybody, and I'll see you next week. Be well, stay safe. Bye.
Bye.